The moment I heard my daughter-in-law discussing a future that did not include me, I realized surviving surgery might be the easiest part of what was ahead. My name is Evelyn Carter. I was 74 years old when a routine medical procedure turned into the most revealing week of my life. The surgery itself had gone well, according to the doctors. They were pleased with my recovery. My son Daniel visited every day. My daughter-in-law Rachel rarely left my room. To anyone watching from the outside, she looked devoted, caring, attentive, the kind of family member every patient hopes to have beside them. That was exactly why what happened next was so difficult to believe. It was close to midnight on my third night in the hospital. The hallway outside my room was quiet except for the occasional squeak of a cart rolling past. A television mounted in the corner played silently while dim lights cast long shadows across the walls. I had been drifting in and out of sleep when I heard the door open. At first, I assumed it was a nurse checking on me. I kept my eyes closed. My body felt heavy from medication, and I did not have the energy to move. Then I recognized Rachel's voice. "She is finally asleep," she whispered. Another voice answered. A man's voice. I could not immediately tell who it was. "Are you sure?" he asked. "Completely sure," Rachel replied. The mattress shifted slightly as someone sat near my bed. Every instinct told me to open my eyes, but something stopped me. Instead, I remained perfectly still. What I heard next sent a chill through me. "Once she is gone, everything becomes much easier," Rachel said quietly. The room fell silent for a moment. My heart pounded so hard I was certain they would hear it. The man lowered his voice. "You should not talk about that here." Rachel sighed. "I am just saying what everyone is already thinking." Everyone. The word echoed in my mind. Who exactly was everyone? I listened carefully, afraid to miss a single detail. Their conversation continued in fragments. Finances. Decisions. Future arrangements. Papers. None of it made complete sense, but all of it felt wrong. They spoke as though my life had already become an inconvenience to be managed. As though I were no longer sitting in that hospital bed fighting to recover. Eventually, the voices faded. The door opened and closed. They were gone. Only then did I allow my eyes to open. The room looked exactly the same as it had an hour earlier, yet everything had changed. I stared at the ceiling until sunrise. Maybe there was an explanation. Maybe I had misunderstood. But deep down, I knew one thing with absolute certainty. I had overheard a conversation I was never supposed to hear. The next morning, I said nothing about what I had overheard. I smiled when the nurses entered my room. I thanked the doctors for their care. When Rachel arrived carrying a cup of coffee and a cheerful expression, I greeted her exactly as I always had. If she noticed anything different, she did not show it. In fact, she seemed unusually pleased with herself. "You look much better today," she said as she adjusted the flowers beside my bed. "The doctors think you can probably go home tomorrow." I nodded. "That is good news." She smiled warmly. To anyone watching, she looked like the perfect daughter-in-law. That was what made everything so confusing. Throughout the day, I paid closer attention than ever before. Rachel asked questions about my accounts. She offered to help organize my bills. She volunteered to manage appointments while I recovered. Every suggestion sounded reasonable on its own. Yet after hearing that conversation, I could no longer listen to her the same way. By the time I returned home the following afternoon, I felt more alert than I had in weeks. The familiar sight of my house brought comfort, but it also brought a new determination. I needed to understand what was happening. Over the next several days, Rachel became increasingly involved in every aspect of my life. She called daily. Sometimes she stopped by unannounced. She brought groceries, sorted mail, and insisted on helping with paperwork. Daniel seemed grateful for her involvement. "Rachel just wants to make things easier for you," he told me one evening. I forced a smile and changed the subject. Then something happened that I could not ignore. One afternoon, while organizing documents in my home office, I discovered a financial form mixed in with my insurance paperwork. At first glance, it appeared ordinary. Then I noticed my signature near the bottom of the page. My stomach tightened. I stared at the document for several seconds. I did not remember signing it. I read every line carefully. The form authorized expanded access to certain financial information. Nothing dramatic. Nothing that would immediately alarm most people. Yet the signature bothered me. The more I looked at it, the less familiar it felt. I retrieved older documents from a nearby drawer and compared them side by side. The differences were subtle, small enough that many people would never notice. But I noticed. After all, I had been signing my own name for more than 50 years. That evening, I sat alone at the kitchen table studying the document while sunlight faded beyond the windows. Questions circled endlessly through my mind. Had I forgotten signing it during my hospital stay? Had medication affected my memory? Or was something else happening? Then my phone rang. The caller ID displayed a name I barely recognized. Susan Reed, one of the nurses from the hospital. And the moment I answered, I knew she had called for a reason. Susan's voice sounded hesitant when she introduced herself. For a moment, neither of us said much. Then she asked a question that immediately caught my attention. "Mrs. Carter, do you remember signing any financial or legal documents while you were recovering after surgery?" I looked down at the paper still sitting on my kitchen table. "Why are you asking?" Another pause followed. "Because something has been bothering me ever since you were discharged." My grip tightened around the phone. Susan explained that during my hospital stay, there had been several occasions when visitors requested private time with me. That alone was not unusual. Families do it all the time. What concerned her was the timing. According to Susan, some of those visits occurred shortly after I had received medication that left me drowsy and disoriented. "I never saw anything inappropriate," she said carefully. "But I remember thinking it was strange how often paperwork seemed to appear." A chill moved through me. I stared at the signature again. "Do you know who brought the paperwork?" I asked. "I cannot say for certain," Susan replied. "But I do remember your daughter-in-law being present more than once." After the call ended, I sat quietly for several minutes. The house felt unusually still. Outside, the late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the backyard. Inside, my thoughts raced. I retrieved several additional files from my home office and began examining them one by one. At first, everything appeared normal. Insurance forms, medical statements, routine correspondence. Then I found another document with my signature. And another. Some looked authentic. Others did not. The differences were subtle but undeniable. My concern grew with every page. The following morning, Susan called again. This time, she asked if she could meet me in person. We arranged to meet at a small coffee shop near the hospital. When I arrived, she already had a folder resting on the table. Her expression was serious. After exchanging a few polite words, she slid the folder toward me. "I should probably not be doing this," she admitted, "but I felt you deserved to know." Inside were copies of hospital records related to my stay. Most of the information was routine. Admission times, medication schedules, recovery notes. Then I noticed something unusual. Several entries referenced discussions regarding future decision-making authority. My eyes moved slowly across the pages. Certain names appeared repeatedly. Doctors, administrators, family contacts. And one name appeared more often than any other. Rachel Carter. I continued reading. The record suggested conversations had taken place about who could make decisions on my behalf if I became unable to do so myself. My pulse quickened. I had never authorized such discussions. At least, not knowingly. Then I reached the final page in the folder. Attached to it was a copy of a form I had never seen before. Near the bottom sat a signature line and a name connected to the document's preparation. William Parker. I had no idea who he was. But instinct told me that finding out might change everything. For the rest of the day, the name William Parker remained in my thoughts. I had never met him. I had never spoken with him. Yet his name appeared on a document connected to decisions that seemed to involve my future. When I returned home from meeting Susan, I placed the hospital records across my dining room table and began reading them again. This time, I paid attention to every detail. Dates, notes, signatures, references. The deeper I looked, the more uneasy I became. Several entries mentioned discussions about long-term planning and authority over personal affairs. Each reference seemed to lead back to the same small circle of people. Rachel's name appeared repeatedly. So did William Parker's. By evening, I decided I could not sit and wonder any longer. The next morning, I began making phone calls. It did not take long to discover that William Parker was an attorney. More surprising was the fact that he had once worked closely with my late husband, Richard. That information stopped me cold. Richard had passed away nearly 8 years earlier. He had always been careful with finances and legal matters. If William had been someone Richard trusted, there had to be a reason. I scheduled an appointment immediately. 2 days later, I walked into a modest office building on the other side of town. The reception area was quiet and professional. Framed certificates lined the walls. Everything about the place felt organized. Intentional. A few minutes later, William Parker entered the waiting room. He looked to be in his early 60s, with silver hair and a calm expression. The moment he heard my name, something changed in his face. Recognition. Almost relief. "Mrs. Carter," he said warmly. "I have been hoping we would meet one day, although not under these circumstances." My pulse quickened. He led me into his office and closed the door. For the next hour, we talked. At first, he asked questions about my recovery and my family. Then the conversation shifted. I showed him copies of the hospital records. I showed him the financial document that carried a signature I did not fully recognize. He examined everything carefully. Finally, he leaned back in his chair. "Your husband anticipated problems years ago," he said quietly. Those words hit me harder than I expected. Richard had always been thoughtful, but this sounded different. Deliberate. Prepared. William stood and walked toward a locked cabinet behind his desk. He removed a small box and carried it back to the table. The box was worn with age. Across the lid was a handwritten label. My breath caught the moment I saw it. The writing belonged to Richard. William placed the box in front of me. "He instructed me to keep this safe," he said, "and only give it to you if there ever came a time when you stopped trusting the people closest to you." Inside that box, I suspected, were answers I had not even known to ask. The box remained unopened for nearly a full minute. I simply stared at Richard's handwriting while William sat quietly across from me. My husband had been gone for 8 years, yet somehow he was still finding ways to reach me. Finally, I lifted the lid. Inside were several neatly organized folders, a sealed envelope, and a small notebook. Everything looked exactly like something Richard would prepare. Careful. Methodical. Thorough. The envelope rested on top. Written across the front were words that immediately tightened my chest. "Open only if you stop trusting your family." My hands trembled slightly as I broke the seal. The letter inside was several pages long. Richard began by telling me how much he loved me. Then his tone shifted. He explained that during the final years of his life, he had noticed conversations that troubled him. At first, he dismissed them as misunderstandings. Later, he stopped dismissing them. He described repeated discussions involving future control of assets, property, and personal decision-making. He never accused anyone directly. Instead, he documented facts, dates, meetings, requests, patterns. That was exactly how Richard approached every problem. As I continued reading, I felt a growing sense of disbelief. Many of the names mentioned were familiar. Some belonged to professionals. Others belonged to family members. One name appeared more often than any other. Rachel Carter. I lowered the letter and looked at William. He nodded slowly. "Keep reading," he said. The next section explained why Richard had hired William years earlier to create additional safeguards around certain accounts and legal documents. He worried that if something happened to me, decisions might be made that did not reflect my wishes. More importantly, he worried that pressure could be applied during periods of illness or vulnerability. My mind immediately returned to the hospital room. The late-night conversation. The suspicious signatures. The unusual paperwork. Suddenly, separate pieces of the puzzle were beginning to connect. Beneath the letter sat the small notebook. Inside were handwritten observations Richard had recorded over several years. None of them proved wrongdoing. but together they revealed a pattern of growing concern. Then I reached the final page. Tucked inside was a note attached to a small digital storage card. My pulse quickened. Richard's handwriting covered only a single sentence. If you are reading this, there is something you need to hear for yourself. I looked up at William. What is on this? I asked. His expression turned serious. An audio recording Richard asked me to protect. The room suddenly felt very quiet. Outside the office window, traffic moved through the afternoon as though nothing had changed. Yet everything had changed. The answers I had been searching for were finally within reach. And whatever existed on that recording was important enough for Richard to preserve long before any of the events now unfolding in my life. William removed a small device from his desk drawer and carefully inserted the storage card. For a moment, neither of us spoke. The office seemed unusually quiet. Even the sounds from the street outside felt distant. Then he pressed play. A soft crackle filled the room before I heard a voice I had not heard in years. Richard's voice. My breath caught immediately. It was unmistakably him. Calm, thoughtful, steady. For several seconds, I forgot why I was there. I simply listened. Richard began by explaining when the recording had been made. He said he hoped I would never need to hear it. He said he would much rather be sitting beside me than speaking through a recording. Then his tone became more serious. He described concerns that had developed slowly over time. He spoke about conversations that left him uneasy. Requests that seemed harmless at first. Questions about property. Questions about authority. Questions about what might happen if either of us became unable to manage our own affairs. He explained that patterns matter more than isolated events. That was something he always believed. Then he mentioned Rachel. Not with anger. Not with accusations. Simply as a matter of fact. He explained that several interactions involving Rachel had caused him concern over the years. He had documented them. He had discussed them with William. Most importantly, he had taken steps to protect my independence should circumstances ever place me in a vulnerable position. My eyes filled with tears as I listened. Even now, years after his death, Richard was trying to protect me. The recording continued. Richard urged me never to surrender control of important decisions without understanding every detail. He reminded me that trust should never replace verification. Then came the sentence that affected me most. If you are hearing this, someone may be trying to convince you that dependence is the same thing as care. It is not. The room felt completely still. When the recording finally ended, neither William nor I spoke for several moments. Eventually, he opened another folder from the box. Inside were copies of legal protections Richard had established years earlier. Some involved financial accounts. Others involved decision-making authority. Every document had been properly executed and securely stored. Richard had thought of everything. As I reviewed the paperwork, a strange feeling settled over me. For days, I had been overwhelmed by confusion and suspicion. Now those emotions were being replaced by clarity. The pieces were beginning to fit together. Before I left, William handed me copies of several key documents. Keep these somewhere safe, he said. I promised I would. As I walked toward my car, my phone vibrated. A text message from Rachel appeared on the screen. Family dinner Saturday night. We need to discuss some important paperwork. I stared at the message for several seconds. Then I slowly smiled. Rachel believed she was inviting me to a conversation. What she did not realize was that I was finally bringing the truth with me. Saturday arrived with clear skies and unusually warm weather for early spring. From the outside, nothing about the evening seemed unusual. Rachel had prepared a large family dinner at her home. Daniel spent the afternoon grilling in the backyard. Several relatives arrived carrying desserts and side dishes. Laughter drifted through the house. Anyone walking past would have seen a happy family gathering. That illusion lasted exactly as long as Rachel wanted it to. I arrived carrying a small handbag and a folder of documents. Hidden inside the bag was a digital recorder containing copies of the material William had helped me organize. More importantly, I carried something Rachel did not expect. Knowledge. For weeks, she had operated under the assumption that I knew nothing. I intended to keep it that way for a little while longer. Rachel greeted me at the door with a bright smile. "You look wonderful," she said. "I am so glad you came." I smiled back. I would not miss it. Throughout dinner, I observed more than I spoke. Rachel remained unusually attentive. She refilled drinks. She complimented everyone. She steered conversations whenever they drifted towards sensitive subjects. The performance was impressive. Yet now that I knew what to look for, I noticed things I would have missed before. Every time finances were mentioned, Rachel paid close attention. Every time future plans came up, she guided the discussion. Every detail seemed calculated. After dessert, she finally moved the evening toward its real purpose. "There is something practical we should discuss," she announced. Several family members exchanged curious looks. Daniel nodded as though he already knew where the conversation was heading. Rachel retrieved a folder from a nearby cabinet and placed it on the dining table. "We all want what is best for Evelyn," she said, "especially after her health scare." I felt every eye in the room shift toward me. Rachel opened the folder and removed several documents. She spoke calmly and confidently. According to her explanation, the paperwork would simply make future decisions easier. It would help avoid confusion. It would ensure everything remained organized. Her words sounded reasonable. That was what made them dangerous. People rarely question something that sounds helpful. Then Rachel slid a pen across the table toward me. "There is no rush," she said with a smile. "But this would give everyone peace of mind." I looked down at the papers. Several names and legal terms immediately caught my attention. Some of the language resembled documents I had already seen in the hospital records. My pulse quickened, but my face remained calm. Around the table, relatives waited for my response. Rachel appeared completely confident. She believed the evening was unfolding exactly as planned. Slowly, I placed my hand on my handbag. Inside rested the recorder and the evidence Richard had preserved years ago. Then I looked directly at Rachel and smiled. "Before I sign anything," I said, "there is something I think everyone here deserves to hear first." For a few seconds, nobody spoke. Rachel's smile remained in place, but I noticed something shift behind her eyes. It was the first sign of uncertainty I had seen from her all evening. Slowly, I removed the recorder from my handbag and placed it on the dining table. Around us, family members exchanged confused glances. Daniel frowned. "Mom, what is this?" he asked. I looked at my son and smiled gently. "Something your father wanted all of us to hear." The room became silent. Rachel's expression tightened almost immediately. "Evelyn, this is not really necessary," she said. Her voice remained pleasant, but there was tension beneath it now. I ignored the comment and pressed play. Richard's voice filled the room. Several relatives gasped softly. Even after all these years, hearing him speak had an effect on everyone. The recording began exactly as it had in William's office. Richard spoke calmly about family, responsibility, and the importance of protecting the people we love. Then he explained why he had spent years documenting certain concerns. He described repeated discussions involving future control of finances, property, and personal decision-making. No accusations. No anger. Only facts. The room remained completely still. As the recording continued, I opened the folder William had prepared and distributed copies of several documents around the table. Family members examined dates, notes, and legal records while Richard's voice explained the context behind them. Piece by piece, a larger picture emerged. Several relatives looked from the documents back to Rachel. Others lowered their eyes and continued reading. Daniel appeared especially unsettled. The confidence Rachel had displayed earlier was fading quickly. Then the recording reached the section that mattered most. Richard explained why he had established legal safeguards to protect my independence during periods of illness or vulnerability. He described his concern that pressure could someday be applied when I was least capable of defending my own interests. My heart pounded as everyone listened. Finally, Richard spoke the sentence that changed the entire atmosphere of the room. "If anyone ever asks Evelyn to surrender authority over her own life, make certain she understands every word before she signs anything." Silence followed. Heavy silence. Nobody rushed to speak. Nobody argued. The evidence sitting on the table spoke for itself. I then shared copies of the hospital records Susan had provided. The references to decision-making authority. The unusual paperwork. The signatures I could not fully recognize. The timeline connected too many details to ignore. Rachel attempted to respond. She insisted everything had been misunderstood. She claimed she had only been trying to help. But the certainty she carried earlier was gone. Questions began coming from every direction. Relatives wanted explanations. Daniel wanted answers. For the first time, Rachel found herself unable to control the conversation. Then the front door opened. William Parker stepped inside carrying one final folder. He approached the table calmly and placed it beside the recorder. Every eye followed the movement. Before anyone reaches a conclusion, he said quietly, "There is one last document Richard instructed me to present if this day ever arrived." The room remained silent as William Parker opened the final folder. Nobody interrupted him. Nobody even reached for a glass of water. The atmosphere had changed completely from the cheerful family dinner Rachel had planned only a few hours earlier. Every person at the table understood that something important was about to happen. William carefully removed a document and placed it in the center of the table. Richard prepared this several years before his death, he said. It was updated periodically and reviewed under legal supervision. He paused and looked around the room. He instructed me to release it only if there were signs that Evelyn's independence might be threatened. My eyes drifted toward Rachel. She sat motionless. The confidence that had carried her through most of the evening had vanished. Daniel looked equally unsettled. William continued explaining the document. It confirmed the legal protections Richard had established. It detailed specific instructions regarding financial authority, personal decision-making, and long-term care arrangements. Most importantly, it made one thing absolutely clear. No individual could assume control over my affairs without my direct and informed consent. Every safeguard Richard had described in his recording existed in writing. Every signature had been verified. Every provision had been properly documented. Several relatives quietly reviewed the pages. The expressions around the table told the story without words. Surprise, concern, realization. Richard had anticipated circumstances almost identical to the ones now unfolding. That realization seemed to affect everyone. Then Daniel finally spoke. His voice sounded softer than usual. Why would Dad think any of this was necessary? The question lingered in the air. William answered carefully. Because he believed preparation was an act of love. He hoped these protections would never be needed. Nobody argued with that. The evidence was too thorough. The planning too deliberate. For the first time all evening, Rachel attempted to explain herself. She insisted her intentions had always been good. She said she had only wanted to help organize things while I recovered. Some of what she said may even have been true. But intentions alone could not erase the pattern that had emerged. The late-night conversation in the hospital. The unusual paperwork. The pressure to sign documents. The repeated efforts to influence decisions while I was recovering from surgery. When viewed separately, each incident might have seemed harmless. Together, they told a different story. Daniel lowered his eyes. It was obvious he was struggling to reconcile everything he had learned. I felt sympathy for him. He loved his wife. He loved his mother. Yet the facts sitting on the table could not be ignored. Eventually, the conversation slowed. Family members began gathering their belongings. No one shouted. No dramatic confrontation erupted. There was no need. The truth had already spoken. One by one, relatives approached me before leaving. Some offered hugs. Others simply squeezed my hand. Their gestures carried a message words could not fully express. They understood now. As the evening came to an end, Rachel quietly left the room. Daniel followed a few minutes later. I watched them go without anger. For weeks, I had imagined how this story might end. I thought I would want revenge. I thought I would feel satisfaction. Instead, I felt something very different. Relief. The burden of uncertainty had finally lifted. Richard had spent years preparing for a moment he hoped would never arrive. Even after his death, he had continued protecting me through careful planning and undeniable truth. Later that night, I returned home and stepped onto my back porch. The air was cool and peaceful. A gentle breeze moved through the garden Richard had loved so much. I sat in my favorite chair and looked across the yard. The stars shone brightly above the trees. For the first time since my surgery, I felt completely calm. The fear that began in a hospital room had led me through suspicion, discovery, and difficult truths. But it had also reminded me of something important. Real love does not control. Real love protects. Richard understood that better than anyone. I unfolded his letter one final time and read the closing sentence. Then I smiled. Not because someone else had lost. Not because I had one. I smiled because the people who truly cared about me had left behind exactly what I needed when life became difficult. Courage, clarity, and the freedom to decide my own future. As the porch light glowed softly behind me and the garden rested beneath the night sky, I realized I had survived much more than surgery. I had survived the moment that revealed who was truly standing beside me all along.